Of course, we all know that Jesus told stories. But Matthew tells us Jesus told the crowd all of these things in parables. And without a parable, he told them nothing. Matthew goes on to tell us that Jesus told stories to fulfill the words of the prophet who said, "I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world." These words of Jesus about the stories that he told encourages us to take them quite seriously. But we can never forget that they are stories. If we take Jesus at his word, we will find hidden truths in these stories if we listen to them. Truths that have been hidden since the foundation of all creation. Unfortunately, Jesus often leaves it up to us to seek out and find this truth. I believe in the New Testament there are only 2 or 3 occasions where Jesus ventures to tell us what a parable means. Most of the time, he leaves us on our own. But I must confess this morning, for years and years, I had no idea what this parable of the talents was all about. I am certain that someone tried to enlighten me to its meaning, but rather than hearing what the story had to say, I took in someone's interpretation of that story. And the interpretation of this parable of the talents went something like this if you went to Sunday school in Cowpen, South Carolina. God gives us all talents. Some of us get more talents than others, like our guest Mary today. She can play the piano, and she plays the organ, and she composes and arranges music for the organ and the piano, and then after breakfast she writes anthems for choirs. Where I come from, Mary is a 5-talent person. And because Mary is a 5-talent person, the only thing left for us to be is envious of Mary for having 5 talents. Because we don't see ours as we see Mary's. And a 5-talent person is a joy of her master, and the master finds joy in his 5-talent servant. But here's the truth that was taught to me through that interpretation of the story in South Carolina. If you don't use your talents, God takes them away. Anybody heard that before? If you don't use those talents, God takes them away. And I lived with that interpretation of this parable for a very, very long time. So you can imagine how surprised and shocked I was to learn that a talent is not whether I can play or sing or dance or write or compose. A talent in this parable is a sum of money. And the money that we're talking about in this parable is a boatload of money. Now, I researched to try to find out exactly what the monetary value of a talent would be in today's standards. Unfortunately, I didn't find a satisfactory answer. But I did read somewhere that a talent was equivalent to 20 years of wages. So, to make this story something I could manage, I determined that a talent had to be worth at least $400,000. Now, this is the way I figured it. $10 an hour, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks in a year, 20 years. And you accountants can check me on this, but I think that comes out to $416,000. But just for the sake of the story, I chose $400,000. When I envisioned this large sum of money, I could see the master calling before him 3 trusted slaves. Now we need to be clear this morning, these slaves were managers. They were stewards of his property. They were most likely well educated and highly experienced. And it is unlikely that this is the first time they have ever been left in charge of his wealth. The master has often gone off and left them to manage his resources. This was a practice that was fairly routine in Jesus' time. The wealthiest of people were merchants and governmental officials. Merchants have to travel the world finding their wares, and government officials have to go home to the home office in Rome every so often. And so when leaving on these long and extended journeys, the wealthy entrusted quite often their wealth, their land, the management of their vineyards, and even their families into the care of their trusted servants. But on this day, in this story, something perhaps unheard of happens. While the other servants are loading the camels, the master stands before 3 of these trusted servants with a briefcase containing $3.2 million. To the one slave, this extravagant master gives $2 million. To another slave, he gives $800,000. And to the third slave, he gives $400,000. And the master takes off, leaving them with absolutely no instruction about what they are to do with these large and extravagant funds. Now, before we get carried away, this story is not just about money. The sums are too extravagant to be real. Folks just didn't have this kind of money in Jesus' time. So I encourage you to remember that this is a story. And don't get sidetracked by some of the details. When we listen to the story with ears to hear, it seems possible that this story is not so much about the money as it is about the servants to whom the money has been entrusted. The first servant, the first manager, takes his $2 million and makes $2 million more as quick as a cat can wink her eye. The second manager takes his $800,000 and turns it into a cool $1.6 million. But the third manager, for some reason, decides to play it safe. So he takes his $400,000 home, digs a hole in the backyard, plants it there, and covers it up. He hides his master's money. Now, as they expected all along, the master does return from this long journey. And when he returns, he calls these managers together to examine the books. The first manager, who had received the $2 million entrusted to him, gave his master another $2 million. The second, who had received $800,000, gave his master back that $800,000 plus another. And the master, he has the same word of blessing for both of these servants. Well done, good and trustworthy servant. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. So far, so good. Until it comes time for the slave, the manager, the servant, with his $400,000. It doesn't begin very well at all. Immediately, this servant stakes out a defensive position. And he says, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid and went and hid your money in the ground. Here, take it back. Now, this is where the story takes a dark turn. You and I we tend to assume that Jesus is going to be on the side of this fearful servant. After all, we always see Jesus on the side of the weak and the poor and the frightened, on the side of the underdog. But not here. In this story, the master shows no mercy to the frightened manager. No mercy whatsoever. Instead, the master takes this posture. If you knew all of this about me, if you knew that I was a harsh man, if I reaped where I did not sow and gathered where I did not scatter, why didn't you at least take my money and put it in the bank so when I returned I would have my money and my interest too? And then he orders his servants to take this man's $400,000 and give it to the slave who has $2 million. The master goes on to say, "For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But for those who have nothing, even that will be taken away." And what about this worthless manager? Well, let's just say it didn't go too well with him. Now, I've tried to listen to this story over and over and over again over the last several days. It appears to me that the hidden truth in this story involves the manager who buried the $400,000 in his backyard. It seems to me that this manager is somehow confused about his master. In similar way that you and I sometimes seem to be confused about God. We see God like this manager. God is harsh. God is cruel. God is indifferent to us human creatures. God waits to give out severe judgment and punishment to us. And that God somehow cannot be trusted. Now, I think that's a lie about God. And I think it's a lie about God that's been around for a long, long time. A lie that says somehow you and I cannot trust God. And we get all kinds of false images about God. But remember, last Sunday in the sermon on Jonah, what did Jonah get mad about? He got mad because God is the opposite of what this manager envisions him of being. God is gracious. God is merciful. God is slow to anger. God is abounding in steadfast love. And God is ready to change his mind and forgive. Now, what's interesting about this story to me is that somehow the steward who received the 5 talents got this. The servant who received 2 talents, he got it too. It appears that neither one of them envisioned their master to be a greedy or harsh man or a demanding man. And they are all in the same boat. The master gives none of them any instructions about what to do with his money. He doesn't tell them to go out and invest it and make more. 2 of them feel free to do so. 1 is frightened and afraid. The 2 who went out and invested those funds, they did not dread the expectations. When they were presented with such outrageous and extravagant amounts of money. And in the end, they are the ones who share both the wealth and the joy of the master. They are the ones who emerge as faithful and trustworthy servants. The third servant has it all wrong. And I'm still wondering how he could get it so wrong. How could he miss this important detail that his other two comrades understood, grasped, and moved forward with? The more I thought about this, I began to think about an African American woman named May, who worked for my family when I was a small boy and took care of me. She washed my clothes, she cooked my lunch, she scrubbed my knees clean of grass stain. And whenever May wanted to keep me in line, she said, "Boy, if you don't behave, the boogeyman is going to get you." Now, I never really knew what the boogeyman was. But it seems to me that this third servant in this parable has God mistaken for the boogeyman. Somebody watching him closely, somebody ready to squash him, somebody just hoping to catch him in some failure. And no wonder, if that is the God he has, no wonder he's anxious and fearful. No wonder he's so afraid. That's what happens when you get stuck with bad ideas, bad images of who God is. But I just don't think it's this manager in this parable. I think quite possibly there are lots of us here this morning who lived very cramped, very anxious, very frightened lives, because our image of God is not one of mercy and grace and steadfast love and patience and a willingness to give. And for that reason, unlike the other two managers, we don't know how to share lavishly and extravagantly what an extravagant God gives to us. We don't know how to go about loving and forgiving and restoring and reconciling because we can't make peace with the God who made us, who calls us by name, who loves us more than anything. As Jonah said, he's a God of mercy, a God of grace, a God slow to anger, a God of abounding love, a God who changes his mind and forgives. This God is our Heavenly Father. This is the God who sets us free to live. This is the God who sets us free to explore our lives and our living and our very selves. This is the God who gives us permission to explore who we are and to give full expression to the image of God impressed upon us. This is the God who breaks our chains and sets us free. This is the God who forgives our sins and removes our guilt. This is the God who sets us free from that toxic shame that crushes us and controls us. This is the God who always invites us to become and to be his beloved sons and daughters. But if you're stuck with the wrong ideas about God, if you see God from the perspective of the lie rather than the hidden truth, then guess what? You'll be stuck with that steward with his $400,000 taken away, always living anxiously, fearfully, and joylessly. The God we come to worship today sets us free to live, and we bring joy to him when we become fully alive. All of us, I think, hope one day to hear, "Well done, my good and trustworthy slave. Come and receive my joy." But we have to believe. the joy of God awaits us. And stop hiding ourselves